Hi, welcome to How We Got Here. Recently, former U.S. president had a case that had previously been dismissed against him that was past the statute of limitation time period, revived, and the New York prosecutor Alvin Bragg, who had withheld hundreds of pages of evidence before a grand jury, elevated the case from a misdemeanor to a felony, and the former president was arraigned and had to go to court. Commentators across the country describe this as an unprecedented act of political prosecution. Well, in this episode, we're going to look back at the pattern of political prosecution throughout history and how those holding power want to destroy challengers to their power. Now, this goes all the way back to the Bible. You have in the book of Samuel, King Saul wanting to destroy David, chasing him all over, and not just him, but his family and supporters. It says, David therefore departed and escaped to the cave of Adullam, where his brethren and all his father's house heard of it. They went down there thither to him. So the family had to flee too. Now, this was the typical behavior of the kings of Israel. For example, when King Jehu came to power, he killed not only the Queen Jezebel, but every member of the former royal family to wipe them out. In Athens, 5th century BC, you have Pericles, and he was wanting power, and he had the former popular leader, Simone, ostracized, which means that you banish them for 10 years, ending their political career. Well, now Pericles is the leader, and he's getting too powerful, and talk is spreading of ostracizing him. So what does Pericles do? He intentionally lets relations with Sparta deteriorate till it breaks out in a war. And then all eyes are off of him, and everybody wants a strong leader in time of war. And so it's a political strategy that when a leader drops in popularity, they want to get into a foreign war. But it's intended to keep control of power. You know, for centuries, the Ottoman Empire, the sultans had harems with lots of wives. Some sultans had 1,000 wives, and that meant they had lots of sons, and they would vie for power. And so the pattern was that whichever son felt like it was the right timing, he would kill all of his siblings and become a ruthless next sultan. In 1444, you had Mehmed II. He became the sultan, and his half brothers suspiciously were killed. In 1595, Mehmed III became the Ottoman sultan. He had all 16 of his brothers strangled to death to eliminate rivalry. Historian Bertrand Russell stated in his Nobel lecture in 1950, over and over again in Mohammedan history, dynasties have come to grief because the sons of a sultan by different mothers could not agree, and in the resulting civil war, universal ruin resulted. And so they justified killing off all their siblings. When there's an attack against the former leader, you hear the term of banana republic. Well, that refers to Central and South America. They grow fruit there like bananas. And so Mexico, from 1821 to 1857, it had 50 different governments. Each new president would destroy the previous president together with their families and supporters in order to prevent them from challenging them in the future. For example, Iturbide was the leader who broke Mexico away from Spain. When a coup forced Iturbide from power, he fled, but then he decided to come back to Mexico, and Santa Anna had him captured and executed in 1824. In 1832, Mexico's president Bustamante was forced into exile. When he returned, he was forced into exile again, ostracized. In 1853, Santa Anna exiled his political challenger, Benito Juarez. When Juarez returned, he succeeded in exiling Santa Anna. And then Maximilian came to power in Mexico, and there were some leaders that went over to Europe and asked him to come over, and he was trying to piece together the country. Well, in 1867, Benito Juarez overthrew Maximilian, captured him. And cries from around the world, from the Pope to Victor Hugo, who wrote Les Miserables and The Hunchback of Notre Dame, they're all crying for Juarez to spare Maximilian's life. But Juarez doesn't want to have another challenger to power, so he has Maximilian shot before a firing squad and then photographs him in his coffin to tell everybody, okay, all of his supporters go home. He's not going to have another chance to seize power. Juarez then puts down a revolt by Porfirio Diaz. When Juarez dies, Porfirio Diaz comes to power. He proceeds to destroy his rivals. Porfirio Diaz is overthrown in a revolt led by Madero, and then Madero was murdered by Huerta in 1913. Huerta was forced out of power by Pancho Villa, Emiliano Zapata, and Alvaro Obregón. And Obregón supported Carranza. I know lots of names here. Huerta was captured and put in prison where he was poisoned, so he couldn't challenge power. Carranza then has Pancho Villa and Zapata killed, but then Carranza is assassinated. And then Obregón is reelected in 1928, but he is at a banquet in his honor and assassinated. And so Calles comes to power. And unfortunately, this is not ancient history for Mexico. On July 2nd, 2018, CNN reported Mexico goes to the polls this weekend. 132 politicians have been killed since campaigning began. Some of them were having selfies with fans and they get shot right there on the selfie camera. And then we'll look at Cuba. 1933, Batista ran the country through puppet presidents. He was notorious as a gang leader for killing off opposition. In 1944, Batista comes to power and then he finishes his term in office, and then he runs Cuba, the politics from behind the scenes, sort of like a former president that builds a headquarters there in the capital. And Batista seizes power in 1952 with the help of the American mafia. And then Castro promises to end Batista's corruption, but Castro ends up becoming worse than Batista. And he has an executioner named Che Guevara. David P. Goldman wrote in Fidel Castro's Mass Murder by the Numbers, he said, Stalin, Hitler, Mao, Pol Pot killed more people in relative terms. After that, it's hard to find a tyrant with a bigger body count than Fidel. And so Fidel's executioner was Che Guevara, who said, writing a letter to his dad, he goes, I discovered I really like killing people. Even MSNBC Chris Matthews stated February 7th, 2020, socialism, younger people like it. Those of us like me who grew up in the Cold War saw some aspects of it like Cuba. I've seen what socialism is like and I don't like it. Okay. Go back to the early 1950s. Remember the Cold War. I believe if Castro and the Reds had won the Cold War, there would have been executions in Central Park, and I might have been one of the ones being executed. And so we've talked about history and be all through the different examples of these coups and eliminating powers, whether it's in the Ottoman Empire, whether it's in Mexico, whether it's in Cuba. But let's look at some other ones. 1920, there's a political party in Germany called the National Socialist Workers' Party. In 1933, the head of it was Hitler, and the party had a violent arm to it, sort of a BLM type of group. They were called brown shirts or Sturmabteilung, which means stormtroopers, because they would storm into the meetings of Hitler's opponents and disrupt them. And then they would block access to buildings and lock arms, and then they would smash windows and set buildings on fire. And oh, gee, their capital got attacked, an insurrection, the burning of the Reichstag, and evidence points to Hitler's own people setting the fire. Well, Hitler blames his opponents for it and then decides to have investigations and rounds them up and have hearings, and then he has them shot without a trial. And when the dust settles, Hitler didn't have any political opponents left. And then we look at Soviet Union, 1934. Stalin is facing a growing anti-Stalinist movement. And then at the same time, he has a supporter, Sergei Kirov, party boss in Leningrad, who's giving speeches praising Stalin. So Stalin has an idea. He would assassinate his own friend, Sergei Kirov, and eliminate a potential rival, and blame the assassination on the anti-Stalinists. And Stalin used this as an excuse to have hearings to investigate the anti-Stalinists, and killed over 1 million of them in the first Great Purge of 1936. And Turkey, you had even Economist magazine talked about the leader Erdogan. And he said, democracy is like a train. You get off once you've reached your destination. So Erdogan got democratically elected, but then once he's in power, he begins to transition to act as a dictator. And when there's an anti-Erdogan movement gaining momentum, he stages a coup against himself and then blames his political opponents for the coup and rounds them up and has them zip-tied and taken away, and they've not been seen since. And so there's one publication called The Middle East Discourse, and it had the headline, Erdogan staged a coup to silence his opposition. So this is this attitude where you want to eliminate your opposition, so you do something bad and blame it on them, and then do investigations to go after them. Let's look at a little American history. Now, traditionally, political attacks in America were somewhat restrained because of basic morals. But let's look at a few. John Adams was the second president, and he was facing a pseudo war with France. And there were dissidents from France that were stirring up discord in America. And so Adams wanted to limit political speech, and Jefferson didn't like that. And so Jefferson, as vice president, is leaking information to the press that is negative against John Adams, and it causes support for John Adams to dissipate so that he does not win re-election. And Adams was so upset that he didn't attend Jefferson's inauguration. He got in a carriage and rode out of town. But now Jefferson faces his muckrackers, is what they called. A muckracker was somebody that was digging up dirt, and it was a notorious guy named James Callender, and Callender. Now, James Callender goes to Virginia to dig up dirt on Jefferson, and he hears rumors that there are children on his plantation of mixed race, and begins to spread rumors of Thomas Jefferson fooling around. Lo and behold, the Thomas Jefferson Heritage Society discredits these accusations, stating even though Monticello relies on DNA tests as proof that Jefferson fathered children of Sally Hemings, there was no DNA of Thomas Jefferson. The DNA used in these tests came from Field Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson's uncle. In 2001, a commission of scholars issued a 450-page report that the DNA test only showed that Sally Hemings' youngest son, Easton Hemings, could have been fathered by any male of the Jefferson family. And they wrote the circumstantial case that Easton Hemings was fathered by the president's younger brother, Randolph Jefferson, is many times stronger than the case against the president himself. A 13-member commission noted that slaves' memoirs asserted that Randolph Jefferson often spent time playing the fiddle and dancing with the slaves when he visited Monticello. And that Thomas's home was only 20 miles from where Randolph lived, and that Randolph visited Monticello exactly 9 months before Sally Hemings had Easton. So that's Jefferson having to deal with this muckraking. Now, Jefferson almost lost his reelection to somebody named Aaron Burr, who was the head of Tammany Hall, the New York political machine. And it was Alexander Hamilton that convinced an elector to switch and support Jefferson. And Aaron Burr was so upset that he later challenged Hamilton to a duel and killed him. Alexander Hamilton was killed by Aaron Burr in a duel. And now Aaron Burr fled and was part of a plot to take part of New Spain, Mexico, and turn it into another country. And he was arrested and indicted on conspiracy and treason, and he was exiled to Europe. He fled. So we're beginning to see some of these interesting political stories. Another is Andrew Jackson, 7th president. He faced muckrackers. One, his wife, Rachel, she was abandoned by her husband, and he's saying, I'm going to divorce you. And she doesn't see him for years. And she meets Andrew Jackson. They fall in love. They get married, only to find out that the former husband never filed the divorce paperwork. So she was legally still married when she married Andrew Jackson. And so the muckrackers began to say, well, this is bigamy. This is all kinds of terrible stuff. And Jackson defended his wife's honor in several duels. They said that he was in so many duels that when he walked, all the bullet fragments in his body, that he rattled like a bag of marbles. Anyway, Jackson described his wife, Rachel, as the most pious person he ever knew. So during the presidential campaign, the muckrackers are personally attacking Jackson's wife, Rachel, so much that she suffers a stroke and dies. And her last words were, I'd rather be a doorkeeper in the house of God than live in the palace in Washington. Well, Rachel was buried on Christmas Eve, 1828, at the Hermitage Estate, dressed in the inaugural gown she would have worn as the First Lady. Weeping profusely, Jackson said, I know it's unmanly, but these tears are due her virtue. She has shed many for me. In the presence of this dear saint, I can and do forgive my enemies. But those vile wretches who have slandered her must look to God for mercy. Jackson stated, heaven will be no heaven to me if I do not meet my wife there. Well, there's many more examples, large and small, and some are quite interesting. Nixon, he won by the largest landslide vote up until that time. He was very popular, but he began to insist that the CIA release the documents of the JFK killing. And Tucker Carlson did a special report that it was right after that that the CIA began to have operatives get involved in a Watergate break-in that was blamed on Nixon that forced him out of office. Now, this tactic, Dick Gebhardt was the Democrat minority leader, and he called it the politics of personal destruction. That you don't just defeat your opponent, you want to destroy your opponent so they will never, ever be able to run against you again. And so when you have a former president being gone after with political persecutions, it sort of fits the mold. Now, all this can sound depressing, but it's just office politics on a national level. Anyone who's worked in an office experiences office politics, undercutting, maligning, gossiping. And so this is just office politics on a national level. And it highlights that for America to work, it needs to have a moral populace. And it needs to be the churches, the schools, teaching young people that, yes, there is a God who is watching you. And this God wants you to be fair. And this God's going to hold you accountable in the future. And of course, we've all sinned. And so this God has provided his own son, Jesus, to die on the cross to pay for all of our sins, right? But for a self-governing republic, we've been operating in a moral basis. But now that we're getting rid of morals, then we're seeing more of the norm of going after your political opponents to destroy them. Now, what America attempted was unique. And John Adams wrote, October 11th, 1798, we have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions unbridled by morality and religion. Avarice or selfishness, greed, ambition, revenge, gallantry would break the strongest cords of our Constitution as easily as a whale goes through a net, right? As a whale goes through a net. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It's wholly inadequate for the government of any other. In other words, our government was designed to govern people who could govern themselves. And the more internal restraints the populace have, the less external restraints we need. And anyway, we've talked about this trend of going after former presidents in unprecedented ways. It's more or less returning to the norm for selfish human politicians and banana republics. Hopefully, with a moral population, we can get back to some decency that we've had and continue having a great country. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this episode of How We Got Here and found it enlightening. God bless you.